Picture this. I'm standing inside a hut no larger than your kitchen, somewhere on the edge of a frozen valley. The wind claws at the walls like it's trying to remember what warmth felt like. Our fire coughs weakly in the hearth, and beside me, a woman presses a glowing stone to her baby's chest so it won't turn blue before sunrise. The air smells of smoke and fear. I can hear the ice shifting in the river below, cracking like distant thunder. Now picture another world. A sun-drenched palace far to the south, where a queen walks barefoot across marble floors that still breathe the desert's heat. Her attendants trail behind her, their feet whispering across stone that could burn the unprepared. She moves slowly, like someone who knows she rules not just a kingdom, but the very temperature of life itself. Two worlds. One ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet, somehow, their survival depends on the same secret. Tonight, I want to take you there, from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms, to uncover what they both once guarded so fiercely. The secret world of queens and servants. Good evening, traveler. I'm glad you found your way here. Before we go anywhere, before frost and fire and the old names of forgotten queens, let's make a small room together. Dim the lights if you can. Let the screen fall to a softer glow. Hear whatever passes for night where you are. A radiator ticking, a bus sighing at the curb, rain rehearsing its delicate drumbeat on glass. Breathe with me. Slow in, slower out. In the hush between those breaths, the past begins to loosen its seams. I'm speaking from a desk that has learned the weight of elbows and the shape of late hours. Beside me sits a chipped mug that remembers stronger coffee than wisdom recommends. The window is open enough to invite a thin thread of air, the kind that smells faintly of smoke and wet stone. Somewhere below, a stray cat performs the ancient patrol of its small kingdom. None of this is important, and somehow all of it is. History likes to arrive in ordinary rooms. It knocks like weather. If you're listening from a small apartment, an overlit dorm, a quiet farmhouse with mice in the walls, or a train that forgets to arrive on time, welcome. Tell me, silently if you prefer, where you are, and at what hour your world is turning. A city at midnight feels like a coin waiting to be flipped. A village at sunrise feels like a prayer someone hasn't finished. Wherever you are, the distance between us is shorter than we think. Warmth travels faster than certainty. Close your eyes a moment, if that's comfortable. Picture an old hearth murmuring to itself. The kind that leaves a patient soot on everything. The kind you smell on coats and hair long after the fire has fainted. Hear the wood crackle as if telling jokes it learned from the forest. Imagine the floor packed hard enough to remember every foot that crossed it. That is where our story begins, not with banners or trumpets, but with breath fogging the cold and hands learning how to keep the tiny world of a room alive. I've walked through palaces, at least in the archives. Floor plans like mazes, lists of spices that read like songs, corridors designed to make the powerful feel more permanent than they were. But whenever I try to understand how people survived, really survived, I find my way back to smaller places. A hut where someone hides a coal in ash because they know the night has teeth. A courtyard where someone turns amphory toward the last warmth of the day. Survival is repetitive. It's a skill like mending. Glamour is a costume. Heat is an economy. Let's agree on a few things before we travel. First, we'll keep our language gentle. There's enough shouting in the world already, and it rarely teaches. Second, we'll remember that people are led by incentives and fears, not by the pure geometry of good and evil. Third, we will try to notice who benefits, who suffers, and who decides, quietly, like tracing the grain of a table you didn't build. If we do that, the past will get less blurry. It won't get kinder, but it may get clearer. If you like, whisper, just to yourself, the climate of your room. Is the air a little cool on your skin? Is the chair too soft or too honest? Little inventories like this anchor us. Historians call it context. Storytellers call it atmosphere. People with cold hands call it necessary. In Valmir, the northern valley we'll visit, context could be measured in degrees that decided whether the bread cracked or forgave. In Setham, the southern empire, atmosphere was a quantity of shade. Rulers kept their power by learning which walls stored the day and which stones surrendered to night. I think about silence a lot. Not the dramatic kind, but the practical silence of people concentrating on staying alive. A mother counting the breaths of a sleeping child. A servant rehearsing her steps so the tray doesn't betray her with noise. A queen walking barefoot in a room of echoes, trying to remember which door keeps faith. You can hear those silences if you lower the volume of your own cleverness. Tonight, that is our method. Less brilliance, more listening. If you want to, adjust your blanket, your hoodie, your borrowed cardigan. Wrap the present around your shoulders like a truce. I'll keep the pace unhurried. We're not here to conquer a syllabus. We're here to sit with some old weather until it tells us why it mattered. In a minute, I'll take you north where the air tastes like iron and the light feels newly invented every morning. Later, we'll follow a road of dust to a city that learned how to drink the sun without drowning. 2 worlds, 1 lesson. Warmth is not a luxury. It's a system people build together, or not at all. You might hear a small refrain from me, now and then, not villains. Systems. When fires went out in Valmir, it wasn't because a wickedness had crept into the wood. It was because the winter arrived early and supply chains, yes, they had them, were brittle. When rumors rose and said them like heat from the stone, it wasn't because a servant grew greedy. It was because the palace's rituals rewarded suspicion more reliably than truth. If we understand those mechanics, we can step away from easy condemnation and closer to useful compassion. I won't ask you to clap or subscribe or spend anything you can't spare. I will ask you to participate with your attention. The attention you give to a story is a small heat and stories notice. If you feel your mind slipping toward tomorrow's duties, that's fine. Bring it back by touching the nearest solid thing. The mug, the armrest, the window frame with its thin film of night. The past is not fragile, it will still be there when you return. Before we move on, one more exercise in seeing. Imagine a pair of hands, not yours, not mine, calloused where the work insists. They set a coal to sleep in ash, knowing that in the morning the coal will wake with less effort than a new flame. Now imagine another pair of hands, ink-stained, jewel-bare, turning a scroll. Those hands are learning how walls breathe at noon and how courtyards exhale at dusk. The same lesson in 2 dialects. Store what the world gives, share what you can keep, design for mercy. Breath in, breath out. If you're comfortable, tell me, again, just in the privacy of your evening, what you hope to find here. Distraction? Calm? A better story to tell yourself about how people behave when fear tightens the knot. You can want all 3. I often do. When I first read of the Ashkeepers, I thought it was myth. When I first saw the palace inventories of Setham, I thought them vanity. But the longer I sat with those records, the more they sounded like the same music. Communities designing warmth, then arguing about who gets to own it. I promise you this. I will not rush to solutions, but I won't strand you in despair either. We will end tonight with a little agency in our pockets, like flint we can strike later. That's the only reason I tell these stories at all. Not to admire the architecture of suffering, but to map the exits. All right, breathe once more the way the fires taught the children in Valmir, quiet in, generous out. Feel your shoulders decide they can be lower than usual. Let the room you're in become an ally. When we step into the cold, we'll take this warmth with us. When we enter the sun, we'll remember that shade is a kind of intelligence. If you wish, you can still whisper your city to the dark. Auckland, Accra, Austin, Jaipur, Johannesburg, Jakarta. A village whose name never met a map. I'll never hear it, not with my ears. But I swear to you, stories carry the weight of listening, and they travel better with company. Ready? Hold the quiet like a lantern. From this soft place we'll begin. When I first read the old chronicles of Valmir, the ink had almost surrendered to time. The parchment smelled faintly of smoke and salt, a sign, perhaps, that it had traveled long before finding its way into the archives where I found it. The handwriting was uneven, patient, and unmistakably human. Whoever wrote it wasn't a scholar or a monk. They were someone who lived close to the bone of the world. And through their words, I met a people who built life out of frost. They called their home the Northern Rim, a stretch of land pressed between the mountains and the wind. Every horizon there looked half frozen, half dreamed. I imagine waking each day in that place was like negotiating with winter. You could not conquer it, only persuaded to let you stay. The people of Valmir weren't kings or warriors in the way history prefers its heroes. They were survivors of smaller ambitions, shepherds, potters, carpenters, fishers who mended their nets with fingers too numb for comfort. Their days were stitched together by small, repetitive miracles. A loaf that rose despite the cold, a calf that lived through the storm, a hearth that stayed lit through the long night. They didn't worship power. They worshipped rhythm. Every dawn began with smoke curling from chimneys like handwriting against the pale sky. You could hear the rhythm of hammers from the forges, the scrape of wooden spoons stirring porridge in iron pots. The air carried a familiar soundtrack of creaking wood, clattering hooves, children laughing at the edge of frostbite. And woven through it all, the breath of songs. Songs that weren't meant to be beautiful, only useful. Lullabies for the sick, chants for stacking wood, prayers disguised as repetition. Even their gods were practical. The northern pantheon was small, made not of marble or thunder but of concepts that kept people alive. Elondra, goddess of warmth, was the most beloved, a figure painted in soot and ochre above doorways, palms extended like open flames. Beneath her were lesser spirits. The ember, who guarded sleep, the whisper, who carried secrets between fires, and the hollow, who reminded people to rest their fears somewhere each night before they slept. You might think this was simple superstition, but reading those records, I began to understand something deeper. Faith, in Valmir, wasn't about divine reward, it was about collective survival. When they lit their fires, they weren't praying to be saved. They were rehearsing the act of not giving up. The land itself seemed complicit in their ritual. The rivers froze clean and slow, like glass poured by a patient god. The mountains gathered snow not as punishment but as promise. What you can endure, you can belong to. And the valleys, though harsh, offered small generosities, frozen berries that thawed just enough to sweeten water, moss that burned when dried, stones that remembered heat. This was the world before the crisis. A world where every hardship was expected, and thus somehow endurable. People measured their days not in hours, but in how many times the fire needed feeding. They spoke of warmth the way others speak of love, something both fragile and essential, something shared in silence more than speech. Children in Valmir learned to listen before they learned to speak. The elders taught them to hear the moods of wind, to read the gossip of snow. If you know how the cold moves, they said, you'll know how to move with it. And so they did, bending their lives around the frost like dancers adjusting to a difficult partner. There was a kind of equality in that cold. The weather didn't care who you were. Even the village elders, those who remembered older winters and older deaths, slept with stones at their feet. Stones heated by the last of the day's embers, tucked into cloth like precious secrets. No one went hungry alone, and no one warned alone either. That was the unspoken law. If one house's fire went out, neighbors shared theirs without question. It wasn't generosity. It was arithmetic. A single fire kept 20 alive. 20 fires kept the valley alive. I remember pausing over one line in the text, written in darker ink, as if the writer had leaned harder on the quill. When warmth travels between hands, the gods walk unseen. That was their philosophy, warmth as currency, kindness as infrastructure. Before gold, before iron, before kings, there was this simple economy. Give heat, receive life. But simplicity doesn't mean ignorance. Valmir wasn't backward. They understood cause and effect with the precision born of necessity. They studied smoke, noticing how certain woods burned longer. They adjusted the shape of their chimneys to trap less heat. They lined walls with woven reeds that held air like quiet insulation. Their science was survival, their laboratories, their homes. Even their art revolved around temperature. The embroidery on winter cloaks wasn't decoration. It was coated insulation, thicker where the thread formed sun patterns. Their pottery was painted not to please the eye but to remind the hand which bowls held heat longest. They made beauty out of function because they had no choice. And yet, for all their pragmatism, Valmir carried a deep serenity. They didn't believe the world was cruel, only that it was testing. To live there was to prove you could be tender in the face of indifference. To love there was to offer warmth knowing it would cost you something. When I imagine them now, I see faces lit by the same orange light that dances across old brick chimneys in modern cities. The difference is scale, not soul. Back then, warmth was visible, a shared act of endurance glowing in every window. They thought they understood the pattern of their world. Cold comes, cold goes. The rivers freeze, the rivers thaw. A season's rhythm, dependable as breath. And for a long time, that rhythm held. Until, one winter, it didn't. It came too soon. That's how every record begins when the story turns, with a sentence so short it feels like a shiver. The scribes of Valmir wrote that the frost arrived before the harvest had time to bow. Crops froze while still standing, their stalks crackling like paper. The fish fled deep water. The animals refused to give milk. And people who had once sung through hardship fell silent. No one panicked at first. Winters had always come. They did what their parents had done, gathered, shared, waited. But the frost didn't pass. It deepened. The logs they stacked smoked but did not burn. Sparks died mid-air, swallowed by wind. The sky stayed gray for weeks. Even the rivers, once moving miracles of patience, froze solid, not the thin ice of early season, but thick, immovable slabs that groaned like tired giants. And the people began to understand that something old had changed its rules. That is where we leave them for now, in the last moment before certainty broke. A valley still humming with faith. Fires still alive, but coughing. The air still full of songs, but quieter. They didn't know it yet, but the world they built on rhythm was about to stumble into silence. And silence, in Valmir, was not peace. It was warning. I can still feel the way the story changes here, like a room losing oxygen. The scribe's handwriting trembles, the sentences shorten, the ink darkens where their hands must have shivered. Every record of that winter begins the same way, the cold forgot its season. At first, no one believed it. Frost had always been a familiar visitor, cruel, yes, but predictable. It arrived like a stern relative, unwelcome yet expected, demanding endurance but keeping its promises. This time, it came early, silent, and infinite. The first sign was the river. I picture it as they described, a silver thread turned to stone overnight. It froze before the fishing boats returned, locking their hulls like insects trapped in amber. The sound of water, that low, patient murmur that filled every evening, vanished. In its absence, the villagers said they could hear their own hearts too loudly. Then came the fields. Crops that should have bent under harvest stiffened instead, brittle as glass. The wheat cracked when touched. Turnips, still buried, became stones. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys for a few desperate days, then faltered, then thinned, then stopped. The valley sky turned black from so much smoke, then white again when the last fires died. People began sleeping closer together, bodies stacked like prayer. Mothers breathed warmth into their children's hands until their own fingers went numb. The songs stopped. Silence expanded through Valmir like a tide. I imagine the scent of that air, wood ash and despair, the kind of smell that settles into fabric and never quite leaves. No one blamed the gods at first. They blamed themselves, for burning the wrong wood, for harvesting too late, for angering the wind with their laughter. That's how people explain the inexplicable, by pretending the universe keeps score. When Elandra's shrine froze solid, the priests carried her soot-painted image indoors, but even there her face turned black and flaked away. The goddess sleeps, they said. She dreams through the cold. Yet the dream stretched on, and faith began to splinter under its own weight. And then, the stranger came. The record names him only once, in a sentence half erased by time. He came bearing dust that remembered the sun. I've turned that line over in my mind more times than I can count. Dust that remembered the sun. What could that mean? Some scholars call it a metaphor for salt or phosphorus. Others think it was volcanic ash carried by storms. But I've learned that in Valmir, literal and sacred were never far apart. Perhaps it really did glow. The chronicles describe him as tall, cloaked, his face hidden except for eyes that flickered like coals. He spoke little. The villagers were too desperate to ask questions. He walked from house to house, carrying a small pouch of something that shimmered faintly in the dark, not gold, not snow. When he reached Myra's hut, yes, that Mira, who would later become legend, her fire had died completely. She had been nursing an infant who was already cold to the touch. The stranger knelt by the hearth, took a pinch of his dust, and scattered it into the ash. The air shifted. Witnesses later said it sounded like breath returning to lungs. Flame burst from the pit, sudden and clean, as though the wood had been waiting for permission. The baby gasped, coughed, and turned pink again. The stranger stood, nodded once, and left without asking for food or coin. By dawn, his footprints had melted into the frost. Some said he was a messenger of Elandra, sent to restore her favor. Others whispered that he was death himself, teaching mercy for sport. Mira said nothing. She kept the child close and watched the flame burn differently, steadier, brighter, with a faint blue at its heart, like a secret remembering itself. That night changed everything. When the villagers saw smoke rising from Myra's chimney again, they came running with frozen fingers and hollow eyes. She showed them the ash that now shimmered faintly blue, even in darkness. It burns longer, she told them. It listens. Word spread quickly. Soon, every house wanted a handful of Myra's ash. They carried it in bowls, in cloth, in cupped palms. When cast into dying fires, it rekindled the flame. The warmth was subtle but patient, not fierce like summer heat, but enduring. Valmir, once on the edge of collapse, began to breathe again. But something fundamental had shifted. Survival, once shared equally, became dependent on this mysterious dust, and on the few who guarded it. The villagers called them ashkeepers, families chosen to tend the ember between houses. At first, it was a humble duty, almost sacred. But as the frost lingered year after year, the ash grew rarer. Some began to trade for it, bread, wool, labor. Others began to steal. The economy of warmth had been born, and with it, inequality. I've always found that moment heartbreaking, not because of greed itself, but because of what it revealed. When survival becomes currency, kindness becomes negotiation. Still, the stories of that first night remain luminous in their detail. One woman swore she saw sparks rise from the stranger's footprints. Another claimed that, in the silence before the fire reignited, she heard a whisper. Bury the embers. Keep them sleeping. Whatever he was, he left behind more than heat. He left a pattern, a way of keeping flame alive even when everything else froze. The villagers began burying small coals in layers of ash each night, retrieving them at dawn to kindle new fires. The practice spread like rumor, then like religion. People began to breathe differently around their hearths, synchronizing their exhalations with the rhythm of flame. They called it the breath pattern of warmth, in through the nose, out through the heart. It sounds poetic now, but to them it was survival science. A controlled rhythm that prevented panic, that kept the body warm by keeping the mind steady. Every generation taught the next. Children practiced on cold mornings, pretending their tiny breaths could wake the coals themselves. The fire no longer belonged to chance or prayer. It belonged to memory, passed from one trembling hand to another. And yet, the records grow quiet after that. No one ever saw the stranger again. Some said he returned to the mountains, where he waits inside the earth for the next great winter. Others believed he was never real at all, just a story the villagers invented to explain the impossible. But I don't think stories are inventions. I think they're measurements, ways of recording change when language doesn't yet have the tools. The arrival of that stranger marked Valmir's first paradigm shift. From faith to system, from ritual to method, from myth to mechanism. The frost didn't end, but the people learned how to live beside it, to cheat it one night at a time. And that tiny rebellion of heat against inevitability, would echo far beyond the valley, carried south by traders, by rumor, by the daughter of a woman whose fire had once gone out. The night the stranger came, the rules of the world cracked, and through that crack, warmth began to think for itself. I think often about that first spark. The one Mira saw leap from her hearth after the stranger's visit. Not the miracle itself, but what came after. The slow, deliberate work of turning awe into routine. That's what civilizations do best. They take a moment of wonder and build a bureaucracy around it. When I walk through the archives now, I can trace how the people of Valmir learned to organize their survival. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible. A new pattern of visits, new kinds of neighbors, new rituals disguised as chores. Within a generation, those changes became law. They began with a question that has followed humanity through every age. If warmth can be shared, who decides how much belongs to whom? The answer took the shape of a network, part faith, part engineering. The villagers created a class of caretakers called ash keepers, chosen not by birth but by steadiness. Their duty was simple in language and immense in consequence. Carry the embers when others' fires failed. Each night, before the last light faded, an ash keeper would visit the homes whose fires had gone weak. They carried clay urns lined with ash and wrapped in wool, inside which slept the glowing heart of another family's hearth. The keeper would kneel, whisper the breath pattern, in through the nose, out through the heart, and press the warm stone into the waiting pit. It was an act of quiet intimacy. Two families breathing together, passing life between them. And when the flame caught, both households would exhale, synchronizing in relief. This was how Valmir survived the endless winters. Through a chain of borrowed warmth, a system more reliable than faith, more tender than trade. But survival systems, like all human creations, have gravity. They pull everything else toward themselves: labor, hierarchy, belief. Within a few seasons, the ash keepers needed organization. The village appointed a council to record who received warmth, who gave it, and how often. Not out of cruelty, out of efficiency. They called it the Book of Embers. Every entry began the same: on this night, the flame traveled from, followed by the names of the families involved. Over time, the book became both census and scripture. If you read it closely, as I have, you can watch cooperation slowly curdle into authority. The keepers began to mark certain houses as dependents, others as donors. The pattern hardened into expectation. Soon, warmth had its own economy. A family rich in embers might trade them for food or tools. A poor one might offer labor in return for a night's heat. It wasn't greed at first. It was accounting. But accounting has a way of turning need into debt. I imagine the council's meetings. Elders hunched over flickering candles, ink freezing in their pots as they argued about fairness. Who deserved warmth most, the sick, the skilled, or the devout? How much could one family give before their own hearth dimmed? What began as survival arithmetic became moral philosophy. They created rules, then ceremonies to justify them. The ash keepers were given a symbol, a spiral carved into bone, representing the cycle of breath and flame. They began wearing it on cords around their necks. In the beginning, the necklace marked duty. Later, it marked status. The spiral spread everywhere. It appeared on doors, carved into spoons, etched into graves. A village once united by cold now divided itself by access to heat. Yet, paradoxically, this hierarchy kept them alive. That's the terrible brilliance of systems. They can be unjust and indispensable at the same time. I picture Myra's daughter, Liana, watching from the corner of her mother's hut as the keepers came and went, learning early that warmth had become something one could earn or lose. She must have understood, even as a child, that the gift the stranger left behind had turned into a ledger. Still, the mechanism worked. The frost continued to press against the valley, but no one froze. The fires dimmed, flickered, revived, always revived. The breath pattern was taught in every home. Children practiced with cupped hands, pretending to wake imaginary coals. The rhythm became communal habit. Inhale memory, exhale mercy. Scholars centuries later would call it primitive thermodynamics, though that phrase feels too clinical for what it really was. The people of Valmir had created a distributed energy network, not of machines, but of trust. I tried once to replicate their method using simple physics. Ash as insulator, ember as stored energy, breath as controlled oxygen flow. The science holds, but the records describe something deeper, something that doesn't fit in equations, the way a flame seemed to respond to intention. When fear filled the room, the fire burned erratically. When calm returned, so did the rhythm. The villagers said warmth was a living spirit, not divine, but conscious. It recognized care. You cannot own warmth, one line reads, you can only invite it. There's beauty in that, and danger too. When you believe a force listens to you, you start to think it listens only to you. By the time Liana reached adolescence, the ash keepers had become both revered and feared. They walked the valley like priests, faces smudged with soot, carrying small satchels of glowing stones. People left offerings outside their huts, food, cloth, carved wooden birds, not as payment, but as apology for needing them. And so, Valmir's faith evolved. Elandra, goddess of warmth, became more distant, less motherly. The keepers took her place as intermediaries. Her temples cooled, her prayers shortened. Warmth was no longer a miracle, it was a managed resource. This is how civilizations forget the difference between gratitude and governance. One parchment I found, dated roughly 50 years after the first frost, contains the minutes of a council meeting. The writing is clean, decisive, almost bureaucratic. The embers must be sealed during the thaw to preserve supply. Distribution resumes at first frost. Unauthorized sharing is forbidden. Unauthorized sharing. The phrase reads like an ancient echo of modern law. I imagine Mira, were she still alive, staring at those words in disbelief. She had shared fire freely once, pressing it into the hands of strangers without thought of return. Now her village guarded it like treasure. Yet the same system that narrowed compassion also expanded survival. The population grew. Houses spread further up the valley. Traders came, carrying stories of southern lands that knew no frost. They left carrying something far more valuable, a handful of blue-tinted ash, sealed in clay. The secret of Valmir began its slow migration. When I study these transitions, I try to remember that none of them were villains. They were people responding to incentives, to hunger, to fear, to the logic of scarcity. When the world tightens, systems tighten with it. I sometimes wonder what the stranger would have thought if he'd returned a generation later. Would he have recognized his gift at all? Would he have smiled, seeing that humanity had turned his miracle into an algorithm of survival? Or would he have wept, realizing that his dust, that remembered the sun, had become another hierarchy to be managed? We can't know. The records end before they answer. But we can see the trajectory. A culture learning to engineer its own endurance, not through conquest, but through cooperation structured so rigidly it bordered on control. And somewhere in that balance, between kindness and command, a young girl named Liana was growing up, watching warmth treated as currency, wondering what it might mean to live in a world where the fire obeyed rules. What began as a spark of mercy had become a system. And every system, no matter how carefully built, eventually meets the moment when it forgets why it began. I first encountered Mira not in legend, but in ledger. Her name appeared between measurements of grain and lists of repairs. Mira, keeper of ash, recipient of 1 cart of oak wood for service rendered. Nothing about it suggested myth. Yet the margins of that same document told another story. A child healed by warmth, a woman who spoke to wind. The historians of Valmir didn't mean to preserve her, she survived in the cracks between their accounting. When I read her, I didn't see a saint. I saw a tired woman with smoke-stung eyes, still learning how to hold both mercy and method in the same hands. Mira had lived through the first impossible winter. She was there the night the stranger came. The baby she saved with the glowing stone. That was her daughter, Liana. The villagers later said the fire had marked her, that the goddess Elandra had branded Mira's bloodline for guardianship. Mira never claimed that. She said only, "I did what I could." That phrase appears 3 times in her surviving notes, the closest thing to humility written in soot. Her hut was small, half buried in the valley slope, its roof a patchwork of moss and clay. Inside, a wooden table, a small oven, bundles of herbs hung from the beams. The ash pit dominated the room, a circle lined with stones blackened to glass. People came there not just for warmth but for counsel. She rarely refused them, though she had little patience for worship. When villagers knelt, she told them, "Pray to the fire if you must, but feed it first." Over the years, her skill with heat became half legend, half labor. She could tell by the color of a coal whether the wood had been cut under a full moon or in rain. She brewed salves in clay pots that hissed when touched by snow. They called her the breath reader, believing she could predict when a storm would turn fatal by listening to the rhythm of the wind through cracks in her walls. Mira kept records, practical ones. She charted temperatures, the burn duration of different woods, the way certain minerals changed the flame's hue. Her notes show a mind that balanced faith with experiment. When she wrote, "Elandra listens through patterns," I think she meant the same thing modern scientists mean when they say, "Data reveals behavior." But the valley needed symbols more than evidence. Over time, the people began to mythologize her calm, her precision, her refusal to panic when others wept. In a world governed by frost, certainty looked like divinity. What the archives never recorded, what I had to imagine, was the texture of her days. The constant smell of soot on her hands, the quiet of evenings spent repairing cracked pottery, the way she must have leaned against her daughter's laughter as proof that the fire's gift had been worth the price. Because there was always a price. When the keepers grew powerful, Mira withdrew. She stopped attending council meetings, refused new titles. The Book of Embers calls this her season of silence. One entry even accuses her of hoarding divine heat. But I suspect she was only tired of watching the miracle become a commodity. Then came the night that ended her story and began her daughter's. It was the longest night of the year, the sky bruised with aurora light. The frost had cracked 2 storage huts, smoke rose from the valley like fading prayers. Mira's hearth, her faithful, quiet companion, sparked violently, as if protesting something. Witnesses said lightning had struck the ridge above. Others whispered sabotage. All we know is this: her home caught fire from within. Neighbors rushed to help, but the storm was too fierce. They saw Mira at the door, carrying her child wrapped in wool. She placed Liana into another woman's arms, then turned back into the flames. Whether she hoped to save her scrolls or her goddess, no one knew. The roof collapsed before anyone could follow. By morning, the hut was a bowl of ash. The fire had burned so hot it melted the stones lining her hearth. And among the ruins, they found something extraordinary. The embers still glowing blue, untouched by wind or snow. The villagers took it as a sign. Elandra had reclaimed her servant. Mira became legend that day, transfigured by her own element. But legend, I think, is just the shape grief takes when memory refuses to die. Liana was 6 years old. The woman who carried her away, a trader from the south, was passing through Valmir on her way to the empire of Sethem. The frost had made travel profitable. Northern goods fetched high prices in warmer lands. She took the orphan as a kindness, or perhaps as a debt repaid, the records differ. What's certain is that Liana left the valley that same week, her small hands still smelling faintly of smoke. I like to imagine her on that journey, bundled in wool too big for her, staring out from the cart as the mountains fell behind. She must have watched the smoke from Valmir shrink into the horizon, not realizing it was her mother's final breath. She carried with her only a small stone wrapped in cloth, a remnant of her mother's hearth, still faintly warm. In Sedhem, everything would have felt inverted. Gone was the white silence of the north. Here the world hummed with color and heat. The empire was an orchestra of sunlight, domes gleaming, spices perfuming the air, streets paved in patterns that looked like frozen fire. For a child who had learned that warmth could vanish overnight, this abundance must have felt impossible. She grew up in service. Traders sold her as part of their household dowry to a merchant family near the capital. Liana learned quickly how to listen without being seen, how to navigate rooms where power was measured not in embers but in shade. Her gray eyes, inherited from the north, caught attention. People said she looked as if she could see the temperature of souls. In the palace, where she eventually served, Liana discovered libraries, rooms filled with scrolls that smelled of cinnamon and dust. She learned to read the southern script, tracing each letter as if it were a new kind of fire. One text in particular caught her attention, the Doctrine of Maris, a treatise written by the servant queens who once ruled Sedhem centuries before. They believed that harmony came from balancing opposites, heat and coolness, desire and restraint, command and service. Their power lay in knowing both sides intimately. Liana must have felt a kinship. She had lived between worlds, fire and frost, privilege and servitude, faith and skepticism. In her, the teachings of two civilizations began to fuse. She started recording her own observations, small, quiet reflections in the margins of palace ledgers. Warmth survives only where power listens. A queen without servants is a flame without breath. No one noticed then that she was inventing a new philosophy, one that would later threaten empires. But before that, she was simply a servant girl remembering her mother's rituals. When the nights in Sedhem grew cooler, she practiced the breath pattern alone in the laundry courtyard, using coals from the kitchen fires. The other servants mocked her northern superstition, until the day their fires wouldn't light and hers did. After that, they came to her quietly, asking for lessons. I can almost see her there, grown but not yet powerful, surrounded by whispering women, teaching them to breathe as her mother had once taught her. In through the nose, out through the heart. She would have smiled softly, the way Mira once did, telling them it wasn't magic, just patience. And in that moment, across distance and time, the line between mother and daughter blurred. Two women, centuries apart, practicing the same rebellion, to make warmth where none should exist. When I close the records and sit back from my desk, I feel their breath on the page, not metaphorically, but as presence. A rhythm that outlived empire, doctrine, and frost. Mira, the woman who refused to let the cold decide. Liana, the girl who learned to carry that defiance into another world. The secret world of queens and servants begins here, not in palaces or wars, but in two hands cupping a fragile glow, deciding, again and again, that life deserves another breath. When I trace the old maps of trade routes between Valmir and Sedhem, I see more than geography. I see veins, a circulatory system through which warmth, story, and survival traveled south. On parchment they look like faint lines of ink, in truth, they were lifelines of memory. Through them, a northern ritual of endurance drifted into the empire of light, carried by merchants, healers, and one quiet servant who remembered how to breathe life into dying coals. Sedhem was the world turned upside down. Where Valmir's silence guarded life, Sedhem's noise celebrated it. The city glittered, a mirage of domes and minarets, the air heavy with myrrh and roasted grain. Streets shimmered with mosaics depicting sun gods and river spirits. And at its heart stood the palace, an organism of marble and gold that seemed to inhale heat and exhale perfume. I remember the first time I saw its reconstruction in the museum. Long corridors designed to channel sunlight, shallow pools engineered to cool the floors, latticed windows that filtered the air like lungs. Even in its ruins, the architecture was still performing its ancient ritual of balance. This was a civilization that worshipped temperature as discipline, not just warmth, but the control of it. Liana arrived there as a servant girl, barely a teenager, her northern gray eyes startling against the copper palette of Setham. She belonged to no one important, which, in an empire built on hierarchy, meant she saw everything. Servants are the witnesses of the world, the ones who overhear history being whispered in the wrong rooms. And Liana, who had learned early to listen for shifts in the wind, began to recognize similar patterns in power. She quickly became indispensable, calm under pressure, precise with her words, attentive to the moods of others. The queen, Asheline of Setham, a scholar and widow, noticed her. There's a line in the palace inventory from that year that makes me smile. New handmaid with eyes the color of cooled iron. Brings warmth to all tasks. The phrase is both literal and symbolic. Asheline was a woman obsessed with equilibrium. She ruled through the language of climate, not just over land, but over emotion. Her court revolved around maintaining poise. The relationship between Liana and the queen began in silence, as most dangerous alliances do. Liana tended the palace lamps, ensuring the wicks burned evenly through the night. Asheline would sometimes wander into the corridors at odd hours, barefoot, trailing the scent of sandalwood and ink. One night, she found Liana whispering the northern breath pattern over a guttering flame. When she asked what she was doing, Liana simply replied, "Listening to the fire think." That answer, according to the records, changed everything. Asheline summoned her again and again, not as a servant but as a curiosity. She wanted to learn this strange discipline from the north, a philosophy of warmth that seemed to merge prayer and physics. In those meetings, Liana taught her how to keep a flame steady in the wind by breathing with it, not against it. The queen, in turn, showed Liana the logic of Setham. How walls were designed to guide the wind's voice, how fountains cooled air through evaporation, how the sun could be used not as a tyrant but as an ally. Two languages of heat, one born of scarcity, the other of excess, began to translate each other. I like to imagine them seated together on the palace balcony, one woman dark-skinned and crowned, the other pale and plain-clothed, both watching the horizon blur in the evening haze. Between them, a single lamp flickering, the boundary between worlds. Over time, their lessons became collaboration. They began to experiment, combining the northern ash with the southern oils, creating a flame that burned cooler but longer, a kind of controlled radiance that could illuminate without consuming. The palace artisans called it breathlight. To the scholars, it was revolutionary. Light that responded to movement, dimming when no one was present, brightening when a hand approached. It was practical magic born from empathy, a fire that learned restraint. This invention spread first through the palace, then through the city. Temples adopted it for evening rituals, claiming it as divine. Merchants installed breathlight in their stalls, saying it brought good fortune. The idea that heat could be guided by harmony rather than dominance seeped into philosophy, architecture, even politics. The queen began issuing decrees in metaphors of climate. "Let no citizen hoard more warmth than they can share," she wrote in one. Balance is the empire's true fire. Under her reign, Setham entered what later historians called its golden equilibrium. But gold, as we know, tarnishes. The more the practice spread, the more it was renamed, rebranded, absorbed into the machinery of empire. Scholars credited Asheline with the discovery, omitting the servant who had taught her how to listen to the flame. Liana's name disappeared from official records, resurfacing only in marginal notes. The handmaid who tends the breathlight. A footnote to her own creation. And yet, silence has its own stubborn way of persisting. The servants of Setham, the laundresses, the lamp tenders, the cooks who sweated in the palace's deep stone kitchens, all learned the northern breath pattern from her. They used it not as art, but as survival, cooling themselves during the hottest hours, warming bread without fire, steadying nerves when tempers flared. The rhythm spread like pulse through the empire's hidden arteries. Even the queen's courtiers, in their arrogance, began adopting it for their own ends. They used it to calm their speech during negotiations, to project serenity during debates. They thought they were mastering a new etiquette. They didn't realize they were participating in quiet rebellion, the servant's rhythm colonizing the master's world. By the time Aisling realized the extent of Lyanna's influence, it was too late to contain it. The rhythm had escaped the palace walls. Street performers incorporated it into songs. Artisans painted spirals of breathlight onto pottery. Children played a game where they tried to keep a candle steady while reciting the ancient words of Elandra. An entire empire breathing in through the nose, out through the heart, unaware that a servant girl from the north had taught them how. Somewhere in the archives, a single document survives from that period, a fragment of correspondence between the queen and her steward. The girl's teachings soothe the people, yet I fear their loyalty bends toward her manner, not my crown. Still, the fires burn cleaner. The nights are calm. That line, "the nights are calm," stays with me. It captures the paradox of all revolutions born in service. Stability built by those who are invisible. In my quieter hours, I imagine Lyanna watching her creation take shape, pride mixed with apprehension. She must have known that ideas, like fire, are impossible to own. Once shared, they choose their own direction. By then, she had grown into something extraordinary. Neither servant nor noble, but translator between worlds. She wore no jewels, yet every courtier deferred to her. They said she could make the air itself obey. And perhaps she could, because by teaching others to breathe with balance, she had taught them something far more dangerous. That warmth and power were not opposites, but reflections. That mastery over heat, over anger, over hunger, over desire, was simply the art of generosity controlled. The empire flourished, unaware it was standing on borrowed breath. From frost to fire, the ritual had found its way home again, transformed, renamed, but unmistakably alive. I sometimes think of that as the moment civilization inhaled together for the first time, a global rhythm, unconscious but shared. And at its center, unseen, stood a woman with smoke-colored eyes who remembered a mother lost to flame, teaching the world how to keep its own from going out. There's a moment, always, when a system confuses stability with virtue. When it begins to mistake the hum of its own machinery for the sound of truth. Setham reached that moment under a sky so bright it almost hurt to look at, the empire's marble cities reflecting sunlight like prophecy. The markets were full, the fountains clean, the nights soft with breathlight that glowed in shades of amber and blue. People whispered that even the gods had grown content. But comfort breeds forgetfulness, and forgetfulness invites the oldest frost of all, fear. I remember standing in the archives, tracing my finger along the last intact decree written in Queen Aisling's own hand. The ink had bled where tears must have fallen, hers, or perhaps her scribe's. It began simply. Something has changed in the light. She wasn't wrong. The breath light, that gentle flame born of balance, began behaving strangely. It flickered blue in places it should not, dimmed during rituals, brightened when no one was near. The scholars blamed impurities in the oil, the priests blamed the faithless, the guards blamed the servants. Fear, as ever, followed the path of least resistance. And at the center of every whispered accusation stood Lyanna, the handmaid who tended the lamps, the woman whose calm had become contagious. For years, she and the queen had worked in quiet partnership. Lyanna's methods made the palace more efficient, more humane. She reorganized labor schedules around the rhythm of heat and rest, reduced sickness among servants, and even advised the architects on airflow. The empire's comfort was built, quite literally, upon her breathing pattern. But ideas, once they escape their origin, develop appetites of their own. The priests began calling the breath pattern the way of Maris, linking it to the long forbidden cult of the servant queens. Women who had ruled through wisdom rather than bloodline, balance rather than conquest. Their temples had been buried centuries before, their followers scattered. To resurrect them, even symbolically, was treason. Rumors spread faster than light. That Lyanna worshipped the ashes of Valmir, not the sun. That she whispered to flames until they answered. That she used the bones of the dead to kindle her lamps. You can see how easily fear invents poetry. Aisling, to her credit, resisted at first. She defended her companion before the council, calling her the Empire's steady breath. But politics is a furnace that burns loyalty quickest. The noble houses had begun to fear the servants' growing unity, the quiet strength they drew from Lyanna's teachings. They said she was not a servant at all, but a queen in disguise, manipulating Aisling through faith. The queen found herself caught between gratitude and survival. Every decree she signed in Lyanna's favor cost her another ally. Every hour she delayed judgment felt like a breath held too long. Then came the night of the eclipsed sun, the omen that undid them. Across Sethem, the breath lights dimmed as if bowing to the darkness. The city fell silent. The people gathered in the squares, clutching their amulets. When the sun returned, its light seemed colder, sharper. The priests declared it a warning from the gods. The flame of balance has turned upon its keeper. The council demanded action. Lyanna was summoned to stand before them, not as an accused criminal, but as a curiosity. They wanted her to explain, to reassure, to confess. She entered the hall in plain linen, her hair braided in the northern style, her eyes unafraid. I've read 4 different accounts of that day. None agree on the details, but all remember the same image. The queen on her throne, eyes hollow. The servant standing before her, hands clasped, calm as winter water. They asked her whether she believed herself divine. She said no. They asked whether she had revived the cult of Maris. She said the cult had never died, it had simply been renamed survival. They asked whether she sought power. She said only, power seeks warmth, as all cold things do. It was her last answer that sealed her fate. When the high priest accused her of sorcery, demanding she renounce her practices, she looked at the assembly, nobles, soldiers, clerics, and spoke the words that would echo through centuries. Fire does not ask who it warms. The hall fell silent. It's easy to see why those words terrified them. They dismantled the entire hierarchy in a single sentence. If warmth asked no permission, if light obeyed no lineage, then the whole architecture of rule, the palace, the priesthood, even the queen's crown, was an illusion. By dawn, Lyanna's title had been stripped. Her chambers sealed. Her followers dispersed. Aisling signed the decree herself. For the preservation of order, it read, and the purity of flame. I've seen her signature. It trembles. The next morning, the guards entered Lyanna's room to escort her to exile. The space was empty. The window shutters half open. On the table, a single lamp still burning with that unmistakable blue core. Beside it, a strand of soot twisted into the shape of a spiral. No body, no note, only the faint scent of myrrh and smoke. Some said she fled north, back to Valmir's ruins. Others claimed the flame consumed her, transforming her into breathlight itself. The pragmatic explanation, that she escaped through the servants' corridors and disappeared into the desert, feels almost too small for the scale of her absence. What matters is what followed. Without her, the balance faltered. The breathlights burned erratically, crops wilted in the heat, tempers flared in the streets. The empire, once proud of its perfect climate, began to choke on its own sunlight. The priests redoubled their rituals. The queen withdrew from public view. Factions formed. Within a decade, Sethem fractured, half its cities swallowed by drought, the other half by revolt. The people blamed the loss of divine favor, never realizing it wasn't gods they'd offended, but the fragile ecology of compassion that Liana had sustained. It's easy, centuries later, to read this as tragedy. But I see it differently, as inevitability. Systems built on control always mistake harmony for ownership. Liana offered them balance, and they demanded dominance. She gave them breath, they wanted leash. Every civilization must choose which form of warmth it worships. The kind that unites, or the kind that consumes. Sedem chose the latter. And like all fires left unchecked, it burned through everything it touched. When I close the scroll that records her disappearance, I can almost hear the sound of the breath-like guttering, a soft sigh before the dark. It reminds me that every empire, no matter how radiant, is one forgotten kindness away from frost. And somewhere beyond those ruins, I like to imagine her still walking, barefoot through the desert night, carrying her mother's stone, teaching the sand how to hold heat a little longer. Because ideas, like embers, never really die. They just wait for someone brave enough to breathe. When I first touched the fragment, it was cold, colder than it should have been. A sliver of parchment, barely the length of my palm, sealed in glass in the Cairo archives. The curator told me it had come from a dig in northern Egypt, near the dry bed of what was once a tributary to the Nile. Carbon dating placed it somewhere around the 3rd century BCE. But it wasn't the age that startled me. It was the handwriting. 2 scripts, side by side, one northern, one desert. The same phrase repeated in 2 tongues. In through the nose, out through the heart. Below it, faint but legible, a name, Liana of Valmir. For a long time, I just stared. Centuries of distance, thousands of miles. And yet here was a breath pattern, a ritual born from frost, reborn in fire, now preserved in dust. Scholars dismissed it as coincidence, of course. 2 cultures, 2 alphabets, one likely copied from the other through trade. But the curve of the letters was too precise, too intimate. It wasn't the kind of imitation that comes from commerce, it was the kind that comes from memory. Someone had carried this rhythm across empires, copying it with reverence. It made me wonder, how much of what we call science is really the archaeology of kindness? The lab reports described faint residues of oil and soot on the fragment, as though it had once been stored near flame. When I read that, I imagined a priest or a scribe centuries after Liana's time, sitting in a small stone chamber, tracing her words as a form of meditation. Maybe they didn't know her story. Maybe they only knew the breath had meaning. In the margins of modern textbooks, we find similar remnants, the unnoticed survival of old wisdom. Engineers study thermal exchange, doctors teach steady breathing to reduce panic, architects design buildings to regulate light and air. All echoes, in different languages, of the same lesson. Warmth shared as energy sustained. History doesn't vanish, it camouflages. I think about that whenever I step into a climate-controlled museum, the hum of air conditioners keeping fragile relics safe. We, too, live by machines that moderate temperature, that promise equilibrium. Our age worships comfort the way Sedem worshipped balance. We've built our own breath lights, glowing screens, steady currents of data and electricity, all designed to hold the dark at bay. And yet, how easily that warmth divides us. The modern city, viewed from above at night, looks like an empire of fire. Millions of lights burning in patterns of ambition, office towers, highways, neighborhoods. But look closer, and you'll see the familiar inequality of flame. Some windows blaze through the night while others stay dark. Some homes overheat, others freeze. We still ration warmth, just with different currency. We tell ourselves we've outgrown the myths of Elandra and Maris, that we no longer kneel before altars of fire. But every gas flare, every coal plant, every digital glow is a temple of its own. We still feed the flames, we just call it economy. When the archaeologists found that fragment, the headlines lasted less than a week. The world had other crises, rising temperatures, melting glaciers, cities flooding under their own heat. I remember reading one article that framed it as trivia. Ancient note reveals early meditation technique. They missed the point entirely. It wasn't meditation, it was survival. The people of Valmir learned to warm one another because the earth itself turned against them. The people of Setham learned to cool themselves because their own success made the air unbearable. Different centuries, same pattern. The planet adjusting faster than our empathy. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine Liana standing in our present, walking through a city lit by electricity instead of breathlight, seeing our devices glow with the same restless pulse. I think she'd recognize the rhythm immediately. She might even smile at our cleverness, the way we've tamed heat into current, traded coals for codes. But she would also see what we've forgotten, that control without care is still conquest. The breath pattern survives, though we no longer name it. Yoga instructors teach it, psychologists prescribe it, soldiers use it to steady aim. Mothers still cradle crying infants and whisper, "Breathe with me." We call it calming, but it's really remembering, the body reawakening an ancient literacy of warmth. It's humbling, isn't it? The same act that kept Myra's child alive now sits inside medical textbooks and smartphone mindfulness apps. We don't pray to Elandra anymore, but her law remains encoded in our biology. Share heat or perish. A few years ago, I visited what's left of Valmir. The valley is quiet now, snowdrifts covering the outlines of houses, a frozen river gleaming where fishermen once sang. I knelt where Myra's hut might have stood and pressed my gloved hand into the snow. Beneath the ice, the earth still held faint warmth from buried minerals. The air was silent, except for the sound of my own breath fogging in front of me. I caught myself murmuring the old pattern, in through the nose, out through the heart, and for a moment, it felt like time folded. As if somewhere beneath my feet, a small ember stirred, recognizing its name. I don't think Liana vanished. I think she diffused, into the systems, the habits, the technologies that came after. Into every engineer who designs for balance, every doctor who teaches calm, every protester who reminds the world that comfort without justice is just another empire waiting to collapse. In that sense, she didn't fail. She evolved. Her story, their story, isn't a warning as much as a mirror. It asks us the same questions her world once faced. How do we define warmth? Who decides who deserves it? And what happens when we forget that every comfort we hold was once a shared fire between frightened strangers? Centuries from now, someone will uncover our fragments, circuits, plastics, lines of code, and wonder what we worshipped. They'll see how we built entire empires of light, powered by what remained of ancient fire. Perhaps they'll call it progress. Perhaps they'll call it the long echo of Valmir. If they read closely enough, though, maybe they'll sense what truly kept us alive, not the machinery, but the instinct beneath it. To pass warmth along, even when the night feels endless. Because every civilization, no matter how advanced, still depends on that same secret. We survive by tending one another's fire. It's late now. The kind of late that blurs the edges of everything, street lights haloed in fog, clocks that seem to hesitate before each tick. I can feel the world cooling around us, the hum of machines softening as if even electricity needs rest. This is where stories return to silence, where embers fade back into the ash that birthed them. I want you to sit with me a moment longer, before we let it go. Close whatever distance separates us. Imagine the same fire we began with, that fragile circle of light in a hut at the world's edge. The woman bent over it, whispering breath into her child's lungs. The stranger standing in the doorway, leaving dust that remembers the sun. The servant who carried that memory south until it became a philosophy. The queen who mistook equilibrium for ownership. The archaeologist centuries later, tracing her name under glass. Each of them reaching for the same thing. Warmth that outlasts them. That's the quiet truth history hides behind its noise. No one ever really wants power, not at first. What we want is security, continuity, the reassurance that the light will still be there when we wake. Power just happens to be the shortest word for that desire. But every system that forgets its origin, every empire that mistakes control for care, begins to lose the very heat it was built to protect. Mira learned that the night her hut burned. Liana learned it in the court that silenced her. And we, standing at the edge of our own burning century, are still learning it. I think about that when I walk home through my city, past apartments glowing in different colors, each window a private hearth. So many small fires, none of them seeing one another. We like to think we've mastered warmth, but it's more honest to say we've privatized it. Yet sometimes, on nights like this, I see a stranger pause to help another with a broken car, a neighbor leaving soup outside an old woman's door, a protester handing water to a police officer. Tiny, irrational gestures of shared heat. And I recognize the same current that moved through Valmir's hands, that kept Setham alive a little longer than it deserved. It always begins the same way, one person deciding not to let the flame die. So, as your room grows quieter, as your screen begins to dim, remember this. The world is still made of breath and stone. We're still shaping it with our exhalations. Every act of patience, every moment of empathy, every small kindness you offer is a coal buried in ash, waiting for someone else to find. Fire does not ask who it warms. It only asks to be tended. From the frozen ashes of Valmir to the sunlit palaces of Setham, the distance between queen and servant was never real, only the distance between fear and understanding. The same line runs through us now, thin and glowing, a thread of heat that refuses extinction. Keep the lights low, let the silence settle, listen to your own breathing, in through the nose, out through the heart. That rhythm you hear isn't mine or yours, it's the world remembering how to stay alive. And when you open your eyes again, carry that warmth somewhere it's needed. Because the story doesn't end here. It never has. Next time, we'll travel deeper, to the lost city of Maris, where silence was law and song was power. But for tonight, let the fire rest. Let it sleep in its circle of ash, trusting that someone, maybe you, will wake it when the cold returns. Good night, traveler. Keep the ember.